Hi and welcome to another YouTube video. In today's video we're going to create a portrait using the AI Artbreeder and then afterwards cleaning up the AI produced image with Photoshop. So first we are here in the Artbreeder portion of this video, and what I wanted to do today is kind of forget about realistic proportions. So like I was really in the mood for making a portrait of someone with like very big eyes and just like a cutesy look, kind of not very realistic but also not like completely unrealistic, but just like very over exaggerated features basically. And so what I was doing was I went to the browse feature of Artbreeder and looked at images that other people had created with Artbreeder that had like very big eyes and looked kind of cutesy. And so I went through the trending tab and got out all of the images that had the features that I wanted, and then I took them and combined them with other images that I had, like other portraits that I had created before that had like very cute and kind of very feminine features, and then I combined them. Of course, I know that you can also go into the genes tab on Artbreeder and you can edit the genes and then have a slider that says eyes open, and when you pull that up the eyes get of course bigger and are opened wider, but that often leads to also like a lot of white being around the iris of the eye, which starts looking very creepy very easily. So I tried to do this with like combining a lot of images that had the features that I wanted. And when I was finished combining these images or portraits that other people had done with the portraits that I had done in the past and liked that had the features that I wanted, which is called crossbreeding in Artbreeder if I'm correct, like this process is called crossbreeding. So when I was done with the crossbreeding, I went to the create tab of Artbreeder where you can combine up to 8 portraits, and it gives you one end result portrait that has like some features from all of the 8 or also less original portraits that you've combined. And so what I did is I had this like huge pool of portraits from the crossbreeding process, and I always combined a number of these portraits together in the create tab to become like one portrait that had the features out of all of these, like 8 or 6 or 4 depending on how many I like chose to do that turn. So that had my favorite features from these number of other portraits, and I really liked the way that this like second batch of portraits came out that had like all of them combined, but those still were a lot of portraits. I think it were about like 25 maybe, and then I combined them again in a way that I thought would maybe make sense, that was like were kind of had similar features or features that I thought would look great together, and then I combined them again until I had a final 3. And originally I wanted to decide between those final 3 which one of those I would make into a portrait with Photoshop, but then I realized another picture that I had in like my collection of portraits that I have done before that had like this like beautiful flowing hair and I think an angle of the face that I really liked. So what I did was I crossbred again and then I combined them again in the create tab, like these 3 that I had done with the face of the one that I already had in my liked portraits with the flowing hair, and then I think it's called style of the style that I had created with all of the different like trending ones, and they all 3 looked so stunning, and then I combined them and I found this one that I was obsessed with and I actually wanted to make into a portrait with Photoshop so badly. So yeah, that's what we are going to do now. I downloaded that image and now it's ready to get a little bit of a cleanup in Photoshop. Okay, so first of all I want to say that of course the things that I'm doing here are not like exclusive Photoshop functions. If you have Procreate or another art program like Krita that is free, for example, you can of course use that as well, but I just used Photoshop because that's what I'm I have access to, because I, for example, don't have any Apple products, so I can't use Procreate. Sadly, I really want to use Procreate one of these days, but yeah, so I used Photoshop for this, and what I did was I basically just cleaned up the like artifacts in the skin and just in the face in general that were there like as artifacts of the AI creating this portrait. So I cleaned those up. Usually when I do this, I also go through a process of like basically tracing the facial features to see if they are I don't know, correctly from the proportions standpoints, because oftentimes if you already have this like beautifully rendered skin and texture from the face and in the portrait, when you go out of Artbreeder, you don't really see if there are some things wrong with the like proportions, because it already looks so right that you don't see it. So usually I strip away like all of the skin and stuff and just go with the outlines and see if the outlines are proportionally correct, and if they are not, I correct them. But this time, as I said, I didn't really want to focus on proportion. I just wanted to focus on making it look cute, and I was so happy with how the portrait came out of Artbreeder that I didn't really wanted to change any proportions, even if they weren't like exactly correct. So I just skipped that step, which is a pretty important step, so maybe I shouldn't have, but I did, and I just went like straight to cleanup mode. So you can see like there are some areas where there are like, I don't know, some like dark or light spots where there aren't supposed to be, or sometimes there are very like harsh borders in shadows and stuff, where the shadows aren't really like the right shape. So then I just went in with like a human look onto this portrait and trying to fix it and making it look more human and more natural, and I hope I succeeded in that. And after adjusting some of the shading, I am so happy with how this thing, I think it's called Philtrum, is it came out. It's this area between the dip in the upper lip and the nose, and I think it came out so cute on this portrait. I'm very happy with the shading there. And then I went on to the eyes, and the eyes in the AI portrait, so in the Artbreeder portrait, didn't really have a distinctive color. I think it was kind of a brown, green, gray color, but I decided that I really wanted to lean into the green, because I don't know, I was in the mood to paint green eyes, and that's the nice thing if you have the freedom to, I don't know, paint over the AI created portrait then afterwards. So I gave her green eyes, which I thought turned out very nice. I had lots of fun with the lighting in the eye, and I thought that the original lighting, like these very sharp light drops in the eye, already looked amazing in the original, so I tried to keep them as close to that as possible, and yeah, I had lots of fun in the process. And because I didn't adjust the proportions this much this time, I could just let the rest of the eyes be and just keep existing the other times when I've done this. I have 3 other videos, by the way, where I did this Artbreeder featuring Photoshop thing, so if you're interested in that, they're going to be linked in the video description. But yeah, the other 3 times that I did this, I always had to adjust the eye position, so I kind of basically painted a new eye, and that always led me with a very sticky situation, which was that I had to paint eyelashes, and painting eyelashes is not my forte whatsoever. So I really struggle with painting eyelashes, and I really have to practice that, and I'm already doing that, but I'm not where I want to be yet. So this time it was very handy for me that I could just let the eyelashes keep existing, and I don't know, cleaned them up a little bit, added a little bit to them, but like kept the main eyelash shape in place, which was very handy, and I was very thankful for. In addition to that, I also added a few new highlights on the nose, on the chin, chin, on the eyelid, and on the cheekbones, and I thought that these highlights already made the face glow a little bit more. And then later I add on to that glow effect with like some real like Photoshop effects, but first I just did it with pure highlights, and this already I think had a very nice effect. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering which brush I am using, this is the blender brush from one of my favorite YouTubers, Jezza. If you're interested in art and art YouTube channels, you probably know about Jezza, but he has a brush pack that I am obsessed with. It sadly costs something, so it's not like a free brush, but I basically used this blender brush on like everywhere in this face and in this process. And now I only add an earring and some additional hairs that kind of like add new highlights or something, or maybe you can't even see the new hairs really. But yeah, so after I did the earring and the hair, I am basically complete with altering like the effects and the shading and stuff. And now all that is left to do is play around with like effects and making the image look a little bit nicer that way. And so the normal effects that you probably know are the saturation slider or playing around with the lighting and stuff, and I did all that, but like, I don't know, really basic, so not too noticeable. But where the real magic happens is with the curves slider, and curves is such a powerful tool that I really like playing around with. And in this case I started with the highlights first, and so what I did here was first I took the general curve, like the general lighting curve, and I made a point in the middle of that curve that at this point isn't a curve yet, but it's just like a linear, I don't know, a linear thing that goes up. But in the middle I made a dot, and then I pulled that one up, so it created a curve that is very steep at the beginning and then almost flat in the end, and that adjusts the lighting and make. Now with the bright lighting, I kind of wanted the lighting for the highlights in this face to have a kind of yellowish reddish touch. So what I did is I went to R for red and G for green, and also pulled these lines up to be curves similar to the curve, similar to the general curve that I created, so with the steep beginning and the flat end, so that these two colors are also more prominent in the highlights, and that gave me like a very overly highlighted, like a very bright and kind of yellowish tinted image. And then I clicked on that layer that is like completely white, and I pressed Ctrl I to invert it so it was a completely black layer, and then you couldn't see the effect anymore. And then I used an airbrush and kind of airbrushed in white on top of that layer, and added the effect that the curve had onto the image only in those areas where I painted white onto the layer. And it is a very nice effect, and it adds very natural looking highlights in my opinion. And so this way I was able to create kind of very natural and yellowish looking highlights. And then after that I worked with the shading layer, which was the exact same thing. So I made a dot in the middle, but then instead of pulling that dot up, I pulled it down, which adds more emphasis to the shadows and makes the painting in general more dark. So I pulled that down, this curve, and I wanted it to have a more purpley bluish touch. So I took away from the green, and then the shading had a little bit more of a bluish purplish touch as I wanted. And then I did exactly the same thing. I pressed Ctrl I to invert the layer that those curves were on, and I took a white airbrush to only choose those areas where I wanted this shadow to be, which is very handy for wavy hair, because with the wavy hair you can have the highlights in those areas where there is light, and like where the hair goes up and where there are basically like dips in the hair, you can add the shading. And then when you add some Gaussian blur to those layers with the effects, it looks very natural wavy hair. I love it. And I also added that to the face a little bit, but of course always kind of very lightly, and I also adjusted the opacity of those effect layers to not be as intense because it can get too intense very easily. And then on top of that, like as the last little bit, I made another layer and chose the layer style color dodge, and then I made that layer black, and again with a white airbrush with set to 50% opacity and very soft settings. I went over areas that I really wanted to glow, like the highlights in the eyes and on the tip of the nose and on the lips a little bit, so that adds some nice little glow to those areas that you really want to focus on and that you want to highlight. And that was the last little touch that I did on the Photoshop thing. And with that, we have a finished portrait, and I really hope that you like it. I hope that you liked and enjoyed this video. If you would consider subscribing, you would make me super duper happy, and I hope we'll see each other again.